think most people would agree that the claim murder is wrong is a statement about reality, and that this feature of murder is actually universal and objective. But where exactly is the feature of wrongness? Can we observe it? Can we measure it? Can we detect it somehow? Or are human beings taking their own emotional reactions and pretending that these are objective features of the universe? In 1936, the British philosopher Ayer published his Language, Truth and Logic, a book which argued moral statements were not objective but merely an expression of human emotion. According to Ayer, saying murder is wrong is equivalent to saying, "Boo, I don't like murder." And saying charity is good is equivalent to something like, "Hooray, I like charity." Hence, Ayer claims that the utterance of these statements are not discovering moral truths, but in actuality are simply just an expression of emotion and encouraging other people to share your emotional belief. This theory, of course, is called Emotivism. And although reducing moral statements to saying boo and hooray sounds quite infantile and childish, Ayer's argument behind this is actually quite compelling and intellectually very serious. This is because Ayer did not start his philosophical endeavour by attacking morality. He began by trying to destroy meaningless philosophy. Ayer's war against nonsense. Ayer was deeply influenced by a philosophical movement called logical positivism. To put it very simply, the logical positivists believed that philosophers had spent centuries constructing extremely complicated sentences which actually didn't mean anything. This created a particular hostility towards metaphysics. For example, discussions around God, the soul, absolute reality, transcendent purpose, and whatever philosophers invent when ordinary reality is apparently not confusing enough. Their basic question was this: how can we possibly verify any of this? And this led to the invention of the verification principle. Ayer argued that a statement is only meaningful if it is true by definition or can be tested/verified via experience. For example, all bachelors are unmarried men. This is true by definition, as the word bachelor literally means unmarried man. Or, there is a copy of the Bible on my desk. This is because you can verify whether this is true or false. This is because you can look at my desk and see the book and probably question why I own two translations of the thing. But consider a claim such as this: an invisible spiritual reality exists beyond human experience. What evidence could possibly prove or disprove this? If no possible observation could count for or against a statement, Ayer believed the statement did not describe reality. It might sound profound, it might even produce a strong emotional reaction, and best case scenario, it might even get you invited on a podcast. But, according to Ayer, you would not actually be saying anything factual. And I mean, Ayer's original target with the verification principle was metaphysics, as he sought to eliminate the cognitive meaning of it. However, unfortunately for morality, once you create a weapon designed to destroy unverifiable claims, it becomes especially difficult to control where it fires. Where is moral wrongness? Consider the statement, stealing is wrong. And I think if you were to conduct a street interview, most people would agree with that statement. We can observe the act of stealing. We can see somebody taking something which belongs to somebody else. We can examine the consequences. The victim might lose money, feel violated, or be placed in danger. All of these are empirical facts, and to Ayer, have factual value, in that they're cognitively valuable, so have true fact meaning. But you can't exactly see the wrongness. You can't see the wrongness attached to the thing that was stolen. You cannot locate the exact moment an ordinary physical action becomes filled with moral evil. This is because try as we might, but no scientific investigation will ever discover an additional property called wrongness. Hence, whether you deeply despise theft, are completely indifferent to it, or have a liking for it, the observable empirical facts remain the same. Therefore, Ayer argues that stealing is wrong or any other moral claim cannot be an ordinary factual statement, but instead expresses the speaker's emotional reaction to empirical events. And that's why stealing is wrong, according to Ayer, effectively means "Boo, I don't like stealing." Now, this doesn't mean that Ayer supported stealing, murder, or any extremely dire example people use to critique him. This is because he wasn't arguing that anything is morally permissible. In fact, he was kind of arguing the opposite. He was arguing that nothing is morally permissible, nor is anything morally forbidden, as moral claims are not capable of being factually true or false. They only express attitudes. Emotivism is not subjectivism. This is where most people often misunderstand emotivism. Emotivism is not simply the claim that morality is subjective. Rather, Ayer's position is actually much more radical. Where a basic subjectivist might say murder is wrong means I dislike murder, the I dislike murder, according to the subjectivist, is still a factual statement, as it describes the speaker's psychological condition. Hence, it could be true or false, and in doing so maintains truth at value, as someone could claim to dislike murder while secretly being rather enthusiastic about it. But according to emotivism, saying murder is wrong does not report your emotions. It directly expresses them. It is the difference between saying, I'm angry with you, and shouting, get away from me. The first sentence describes emotion, whilst the second performs it. This is why moral statements, according to Ayer, can be neither true nor false. They function more like cheers, insults, rather than scientific descriptions. When I say something is wrong, I'm expressing my disapproval, but I am also trying to influence you to share my disapproval. I'm not merely saying I dislike murder, I'm encouraging you to dislike it with me. Moral language, therefore, according to Ayer, has two features. The first is a personal expression of emotion, and the second is an attempt to shape others' behaviour, which, when you look at how people actually use moral language online, and if we're lucky we might have a few down in the comments section, Ayer's claim isn't entirely ridiculous, and I would argue is probably the closest thing we have to a true understanding of morality, or at least how moral language is used. Why emotivism is convincing. I think it is clear from this video so far that I'm inclined to believe a type of emotivism. Whether this is Ayer's or another type, I'm pretty unsure of and will be revealed later. But I think emotivism is attractive because it explains several things that moral realism and other anti-realist philosophies struggle with. Firstly, and most obviously, it explains why moral disagreements are so emotional. You know, people sit back and calmly disagree on geographical facts, scientific facts, and mathematical problems. Yet, the moment the conversation moves away from these subjects and turns to ones of religion, abortion, punishment, and other topics like these, everyone suddenly starts behaving as though the continuing existence of civilization rests on them winning the argument. Secondly, emotivism explains why moral language motivates us. As Philippa Foot points out, a purely factual statement does not necessarily push us towards action. Knowing a man has been attacked is one thing. However, believing the attack was evil gives you a reason to intervene, condemn, or punish the attacker. Thirdly, and I suppose I'm borrowing from Mackie with this point, emotivism avoids the strange metaphysics of objective moral facts. If objective wrongness exists, what kind of thing is it? It's not physical. It can't be observed like mass, colour, or movement. It does not seem to have any causal impact upon the world. Yet moral realists often speak as though their objective values, quote unquote, are built into the fabric of reality. But when these realists are asked what their values actually are, their explanations are often quite disappointing, as they are suspiciously vague. In contrast, Ayer's answer is much cleaner. You know, there are actions, consequences, emotions, and social rules, but these are not governed by any moral substance hiding behind these things. Hence, emotivism here is essentially borrowing from David Hume, as it argues the mind has a fundamental propensity to project itself upon the world, the problem with the Boo-Hooray theory of ethics. In support of the critics, emotivism does seem too simple. Imagine one person says torturing people is wrong, and another says torturing people is right. Emotivism interprets this as first person shouting boo, and the second hooray. Yet that does not seem to capture the disagreement properly. The first person does not merely dislike the second person's attitude, the first person actually believes that the second person has made an error. They think that the torturer is wrong, even if the torturer feels no guilt, lives in a society in which torture is acceptable, and cannot be emotionally persuaded to change. Yet emotivism struggles to explain this sense of moral disagreement. In defense of Ayer, he could argue that our belief in objective morality is simply a part of how moral language works. This is because I would argue there's a fundamental difference between belief and fact. Hence, there would be no issue in believing that there are objective moral facts, despite there actually not being any. And of course, our belief in objective moral facts is caused by a strong feeling in it, despite there being no actual fact there. In fact, this is pretty ingenious, as more often than not we present our emotions as though they were universal truths, and this is done in order to make our argument seem more persuasive. The personal maxim of "I find murder quite repulsive, unpleasant, and do not want to partake in it" is fundamentally unconvincing compared to the maxim "murder is evil." If we're able to dress morality up as though it were objective, despite there being no objective morality, this makes our commands stronger as they appear to come from the universe, not our own limited knowledge. But this creates another problem. If moral language is fundamentally about changing attitudes, what separates moral reasoning from propaganda? In this sense, the most successful moral speakers would not necessarily be the ones with the best arguments, but it might simply be the person who's best at igniting emotions in others. Whilst this does describe a horrifying amount of political debates, it seems quite strange and almost counterintuitive to suggest this is all moral reasoning can ever be. Can emotivism ever explain logic? Now, this is a more technical objection, and it questions what happens when moral statements appear in logical arguments. For example, if lying is wrong, then encouraging somebody to lie is also wrong. If we assume lying is wrong, it must therefore follow that encouraging somebody to lie is wrong. This looks like a valid argument, but if lying is wrong merely means "boo, I don't like lying," then the argument becomes difficult to explain. In the first premise, the speaker is not necessarily expressing disapproval, they're describing a logical relationship between the two causes, let's say. So the same moral statement seems capable of functioning both as an emotional expression and as part of a rational argument. Basic emotivism, however, does not explain this very well. As it's evident, moral language clearly contains emotion, but it also contains reasoning, consistency, and implication. So when I say lying is wrong and I actually mean "boo, I don't like lying," I'm certainly capturing something. But to say I'm capturing everything doesn't seem as plausible. The problem of verificationism. The deepest problem, however, is not just emotivism itself. Rather, it's the very principle that emotivism rests on. That, of course, being the verification principle. Ayer claims that a statement only has cognitive meaning if it is either true by definition or verified via experience. But can that principle itself be verified? For one, the verification principle isn't true by definition. The verification principle itself also cannot be verified via direct experience nor scientific experiment. Hence, the verification principle seems to be self-refuting, as it can't be verified using its own test. So rather comically in a sense, it destroys itself with the very standard it used to destroy metaphysics. However, some may argue that the verification principle actually acts as a sort of meta-rule, and that this meta-rule does not need to be verified using its own conditions. However, this reframing of the verification principle causes other problems. This is because it becomes essentially a metaphysical rule, and this of course contradicts verificationism as it seeks to eliminate metaphysics. Hence, verificationism must concede to either being a metaphysical rule, which itself has its own problems, or concede to being self-refuting. Both ideas, I think, would make Ayer turn in his grave. More to the point, however, this does not prove that objective morality exists. It simply means that Ayer cannot dismiss moral claims as meaningless merely because they're not scientifically observable or true by definition. So perhaps morality is invented. Perhaps it is emotional. Perhaps objective moral properties actually exist. But what stands is this: Ayer's argument does not settle the issue as decisively as he believed. Conclusion. After this video, I think it would be fair to say that Emotivism presents morality as something human beings do rather than discover. We observe events. We experience anger, disgust, sympathy, and approval. We express these reactions through moral language and attempt to make people share our perspective. When we say murder is wrong, we may not actually be identifying an objective property of murder. We may simply be condemning it with a boo to murder. And I think what Ayer has done with his intellectual project is identified something very important. Moral language obviously expresses emotion. It obviously influences behaviour. And human beings constantly mistake the strength of their feelings for evidence that these feelings reflect objective truth. But Emotivism takes one function of moral language and treats it as the entire thing. This is because moral statements do slightly more than simply express human attitude. Ayer's project sought to eliminate meaningless language from philosophy, yet led us with a more uncomfortable question. When we call something evil, are we actually describing a fact about reality, or have human beings simply learned how to shout their emotions in the so-called grammar of truth? I'll let you decide. Thanks for watching.